Hello, my friends, and welcome to another story time. It is Thursday, and we are 1 week away from Thanksgiving. So I'm going to be reading some Thanksgiving stories today. Just a reminder that we are not having story time next week because of the holiday. I am taking the week off, so no story times. And also, we are going to be closed on Thursday and on Friday. We will open back up that Saturday from 9:30 to 1. So if you need anything before Thanksgiving, some books, some movies, please come in and do that at the beginning of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, because we will be closed. So our first book today is A Charlie Brown Thanksgiving by Charles M. Schulz. And if you know me, you know that I love Charlie Brown. So I thought this would be a good one, and I actually haven't read this one yet, so I thought it would be good. Lucy always held a football for Charlie Brown to kick, and she always pulled it out from under him. It's Thanksgiving. She wouldn't try to trick me on a traditional holiday, Charlie Brown said as he charged at the ball. But Lucy yanked it away and asks, "Isn't it peculiar, Charlie Brown, how some traditions just slowly fade away?" "Holidays always depress me," Charlie Brown said as he checked the mail. "I know what you mean," replied his little sister Sally. "Why should I give thanks on Thanksgiving? What have I got to be thankful for? All it does is make more work for us at school." Thanksgiving is a very important holiday. Ours was the first country in the world to make a national day to give thanks. "What are you going to do on Thanksgiving, Charlie Brown?" Linus asked. "Sally and I are going over to my grandmother's for dinner," replied Charlie Brown. Ring, ring. "Hi, Chuck, this is Peppermint Patty. My dad said I could share Thanksgiving with you, Chuck. And remember that kid, Marcy? She's gonna join us too. And Franklin as well. See you." "3 guests for Thanksgiving, and I'm not even going to be home," moaned Charlie Brown. "You simply have 2 dinners," Linus said calmly. "Cook the first one yourself for your friends, and then you go to your grandmother's with your family for the second one." Easy peasy, right? Charlie Brown's dog, Snoopy, was ready to help. First, he set up the tables and lots of chairs in the backyard. "Okay, Snoopy, that's pretty good," Charlie Brown said. "Come on inside. We need some help with the food." The kids set up an assembly line to make Thanksgiving dinner. Charlie Brown and Linus put bread in the toasters. When the toast popped up, Snoopy spread butter on it. Then Snoopy raced around the kitchen making popcorn and filling bowls with jelly beans, potato chips, and pretzels. Soon everyone arrived. It was time for Thanksgiving dinner. "Before we are served, shouldn't we say grace?" asked Peppermint Patty. Linus stood up. "In the year 1621, the Pilgrims had their first Thanksgiving feast. Elder William Brewster, who was a minister, said a prayer that went something like this: 'We thank God for our homes and our food and our safety in a new land. We thank God for the opportunity to create a new world for freedom and justice.'" "Amen," said Peppermint Patty. On each plate, Snoopy proudly placed 2 slices of toast, a pile of popcorn, a handful of pretzels, and lots of jelly beans. Then he sailed each plate down the table like a frisbee. "What blockhead cooked all this?" Peppermint Patty asked angrily when she saw the funny food. "Don't you know anything about Thanksgiving dinner?" Charlie Brown got up from the table and sadly walked away. "You're kind of tough on Charlie Brown, aren't you, sir?" Marcy asked. "Rough? We were supposed to be served a real Thanksgiving dinner," replied Peppermint Patty. "Sir," asked Marcy, "did he invite you for dinner, or did you invite yourself and us too?" "I never thought of it like that," Peppermint Patty admitted. "Marcy, maybe you can go to old Chuck and patch things up for me." Marcy found Charlie Brown inside. Don't feel bad, Chuck. Peppermint Patty didn't mean all those things she said. I just feel bad because I ruined everyone's Thanksgiving, Charlie Brown said. But Thanksgiving is more than eating, Chuck, Marcy said. We should just be thankful for being together. Peppermint Patty peeked into the room. Apologies accepted, Chuck, old boy. Sure, Charlie Brown said. Good grief, it's 4 o'clock, Charlie Brown said. He called his grandmother and told her that all his friends were still there and that none of them had eaten dinner yet, so she invited everyone to Thanksgiving dinner at her house. Hooray, cheered the Peanuts gang. They piled into the station wagon and began to sing, Over the river and through the woods to grandmother's house we go. Back at Charlie Brown's house, Snoopy and Woodstock decided to celebrate Thanksgiving on their own with a turkey dinner and all the trimmings. Happy Thanksgiving. The end. Now for our second book, we are going to read Cranberry Thanksgiving, and it's by Wendy and Harry Devlin. And I haven't read this one either, so we'll get to read this one for the first time together. Maggie darted about like a black-stocking bird in search of wood for the fireplace. She and her grandmother lived at the edge of a lonely cranberry bog in New England, and the winds were cold at the edge of the sea. Today, Mr. Whiskers was helping Maggie with her chores, and they soon had armfuls of firewood. Happy Thanksgiving Day, Mr. Whiskers, Maggie smiled at her friend. That wasn't his real name, of course. It was Uriah Peabody, but Maggie had called him Mr. Whiskers ever since she could remember. Maggie was very fond of Mr. Whiskers. Her grandmother was not. Too many whiskers and not enough soap, she often said to Maggie. Mr. Whiskers indeed, sniffed Grandmother, peeking from her kitchen window. She pulled the curtains tight again. Whenever Grandmother baked her cranberry bread, she pulled her curtains tight. The reason for this was that her cranberry bread was the most famous for miles around. It was so famous that bakers all over the countryside had offered great sums of money for the recipe. Although Grandmother scoffed at the whole idea, she still felt it was something wonderful to leave Maggie. She carefully hid the recipe behind a brick in the fireplace. Oh, a lot of people would like to get that recipe, she fumed to herself, especially Maggie's clam-digging friend, Mr. Whiskers. Strange how he always showed up when she took down the great yellow bowl and all the good things that went into it. Scat, shoo, she would call out the window every time he came too close to the house. But forget all that today. It was Thanksgiving, her favorite day of the year. The cranberries had been picked, boxed, and sent to the market. The dried corn had been soaked and the corn pudding made. The turkey was roasting in the old iron oven. Turnips, tiny green peas, and a pumpkin pie were ready. The cranberry bread was cooling on the wooden board. The real work was done and the feast was almost ready. Every year, Grandmother invited a guest for dinner and allowed Maggie to do the same. Ask someone poor or lonely, she always said. It never mattered to Maggie or her grandmother that the red carpet was worn and mended or that the silver spoons didn't match. Friendship and sharing were important, but everyone knew that. Red-cheeked, Maggie raced into the house. While she changed, Grandmother excitedly told her whom she had invited. Mr. Horace was his name, and he was staying at the town hotel. He actually bows and he has a gold cane and smells of lavender, said Grandmother happily, and he's all alone. Maggie looked a little uncertain. My guest doesn't smell of lavender, she began, and he hasn't had a Thanksgiving dinner in 20 years. I invited Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers, Grandmother didn't appear to... Sorry, let me start that over. Mr. Whiskers? Grandmother didn't appear to believe she had heard right. You mean here? In the house? But now she now there was a sound at the door and a loud clanging of the knocker. "Quick, Grandmother, take off your apron." Grandmother opened the door, and there were both guests, Mr. Horace, pink-cheeked and starched, and Mr. Whiskers in his old captain's hat. As they came in, trailing behind the smell of lavender and an aura of clams and seaweed. Mr. Whiskers held up his hands to Grandmother. "Clean," he said. "Oh, and where's your tie?" Grandmother asked. He lifted his long whiskers. "Right here where it's always been," he growled. Maggie thought she saw a smile coming from behind Mr. Whiskers. "Humph," said Grandmother, and taking Mr. Horace's arm, she led them into the dining room. A log fire sputtered, the glasses shone, and certainly no one would notice that the silver spoons didn't match. "Let's sing We Gather Together," said Maggie, trying to warm things up. They all joined in the old hymn and midway began to sing out with cheer and gusto. Grandmother started to trill like a bird until Mr. Whiskers fixed her with a quizzical gaze and shook his ears. "How about 16 men on a dead man's chest?" he roared, slapping his knee. Mr. Horace looked pained. Grandmother peered over her glasses. "Really?" she said. Maggie left the table and reappeared with the roast turkey. The corn pudding, the peas, cranberry, jelly, and turnips soon followed. And then came pale, sweet butter and Grandmother's famous cranberry bread. "Feast of feasts," murmured Mr. Whiskers. "Well, we have all heard about your cranberry bread," chuckled Mr. Horace, "and the recipe hidden in the kitchen fireplace." "It's in the dining room fireplace," said Grandmother, and looking over at Mr. Whiskers, she added, "And you, sir, will never find it." Mr. Whiskers stared at the turkey and pretended not to have heard her. Maggie began to get nervous, but she made sure everyone was served and some of each dish, and they began to eat. What grateful dinner that was, with everything cooked with crisp edges and tender centers. "How delicious," said Maggie. "How exquisite," said Mr. Horace. "How about some more?" said Mr. Whiskers. At last they finished dinner, and Maggie and Grandmother cleared the table and went into the kitchen. "Watch that Whiskers fellow," Grandmother whispered to Maggie. Maggie opened the kitchen door just a small bit and peeked into the dining room. Her eyes widened. "Grandmother, he's found it!" Crash, clumpity. There was a sound of a wild scuffling, shouts, and falling chairs. Two figures pushed to the front door. For a moment, they wrestled at the doorway and then seemed to burst into the purple dusk. One chased the other into the cranberry bog. "The nerve of him stealing our recipe," said Grandmother with a fire in her eye. Maggie knew whom she meant. "It wasn't Mr. Whiskers," she said. "It was Mr. Horace." "Mr. Horace?" Grandmother looked shocked. "But why?" "Because he owns a bakery in the city." "Yes," said Maggie. Wait, hold on. Sorry, let me start over. "Because he owns a bakery in the city." "And Mr. Whiskers knew this?" Grandmother asked. "Yes," said Maggie. "Mr. Whiskers kindly came today to watch Mr. Horace and to have dinner." Mr. Whiskers came puffing up to the door, holding Mr. Horace by the collar. Proudly, he held the recipe high in the other hand. "Don't trust a man because he smells of lavender and has a gold cane," he growled. Grandmother stood up very straight and looked hard at Mr. Horace. "You, sir," she said, "are a disgrace." "He's worse than that," said Mr. Whiskers. "He's a recipe robber," said Maggie. All the starch seemed to leave Mr. Horace. "No pumpkin pie for you, sir," said Grandmother, handing him his cane. Mr. Horace began to sniffle. They left Mr. Horace on the doorstep. Grandmother closed the door firmly, and this time she took Mr. Whiskers' arm into the dining room. Maggie thought she could see Mr. Whiskers smile. They sat by the warm embers of the fire and ate pumpkin pie with whipped cream. "How delicious," said Maggie. "How delightful," said Grandmother. "How about another piece?" said Mr. Whiskers. The wind blew and rattled the shutters outside, and the door came and outside the door came a loud wail from Mr. Horace. Sorry guys, I'm struggling today. Goodness, is he still there? Said Maggie. Shall we let him in? It's Thanksgiving, said Grandmother. It's especially Thanksgiving on a cranberry farm, Maggie replied encouragingly. They looked at Mr. Whiskers. It took great effort on Mr. Whiskers' part, but with the true character, he stood up and said, Maggie, open the door and we shall give him the last piece. How about 16 men on a dead man's chest? Grandmother asked him while Maggie went to the door, and even in his whiskers, he couldn't hide that smile. And in the back of this book, there is the recipe for the cranberry bread. How cute is that? The end. So I hope you guys enjoyed our Thanksgiving stories this week, and I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving next week. I will see you guys when it's December. Bye.